Yeah, me too. Two of us. Well, good morning to all. Thank you very much for being here. It's a good day to be together. Hopefully, last couple of weeks, I know we've had, my family at least, a lot of other folks been sick, a lot of old stuff going around. Hopefully, we're starting to get on the backside of that. But it's very good to be with you all this morning, and maybe you're feeling a little bit better than last week as well. I know I am. So glad to be able to come together and study this morning. Today, we're actually beginning a new course of study. We had been looking for several weeks, a couple of months, at the idea of finding Jesus in the Old Testament, and we're able to, for the most part, wrap that up last week. There's a lot that can be said on that subject, but I wanted to move on into something new this morning. And so I would like to begin today a study of a New Testament book. We're going to be looking at the book of 1 Thessalonians for the next several weeks. One of probably Paul's first letter. It's thought to be the first epistle that we have that Paul wrote to one of these churches, and is in many ways, as all of them are, very useful for us, very useful to see how does a church grow, how do they maintain that growth, what constitutes a successful church, and what kinds of things did they need to know to live by. I think those will be of great aid and assistance to us as well. So a short book, that's always a consideration when I'm trying to figure out, what do we want to study next? What are we going to look at? I know there are some things that are just easier to do than others from a logistical standpoint. If I say we're going to study Romans, then we're either going to be flying through it and probably not doing it particularly well, or we're going to be saying, all right, for the next 2 years, here's what we're going with. And I saw the faces some of you made when I mentioned 2 years. So I know some things like that are just kind of have to be handled in a specific way. For our study, though, we're picking one that's 5 chapters. We can get through it in a manageable time and gain a lot from it, I think. So this morning, I want to, as you would guess, just take the opportunity to introduce things first, and we'll get into the main text next week together and see exactly what Paul has said. But we'll help ourselves by giving a little bit of background first, find out who these people are, why Paul's writing to them, what kind of relationship they had together, and I think that'll help us moving forward. Well, before we do get any further in, let's start today with a prayer. I'll invite you to bow with me, and we'll go to God before we study. Holy Father, we're thankful for this morning, and we pray that as we gather here and offer our worship to you, that you will strengthen us, assist us, be with us. Our service to you, worship and praise that we offer. Pray that you would look down upon us with kindness and with favor, that you would see the gifts we bring to you this morning and receive them with pleasure. May we worship you in faith, love, and with reverence for who you are, especially for what you have done, saving us. We're thankful for your word and give thanks for the examples that we can find within it, for the patterns that are found, those who have lived in faith before us. We pray that we would always look to ourselves when we look at your word, use it as the mirror that it can be and is intended to be. We'd be able to find solutions, guidance, and encouragement for our own lives, what you have committed to these people. Grateful for all those who are here, and we ask your blessing upon each one of us. Help us in all things that are good. Give you thanks in Christ's name. All right, if we are trying to sketch out, we'll kind of work backwards a little bit, I guess, as far as the place. This morning, I want to look just mainly in 3 dimensions. Look at the city, and then look at the church, and then look at the letter Paul wrote to them. We'll kind of introduce things in that way. But working from just general to specific, if you are trying to come up with in your minds, or you're looking to figure out a pattern, if you're thinking of the typical first century city where Paul would go and where you find the gospel being preached, the kind of places that he seemed to gravitate towards. It feels to me very much like when I do an introductory type lesson on any of these places, or when you're kind of giving background information on any place that you're going to consider, whether it's one of the 7 churches of Asia in Revelation, or some of the places you'll encounter in Acts, and you're going to talk about, Corinth or Philippi or wherever else, Thessalonica, wherever else it might be. A lot of it feels very much like Mad Libs, kind of like you're just sort of filling in the blank, but a lot of the other information is going to be very similar. A lot of the basics are going to be similar. If you're looking for that sort of prototype city that Paul is going to establish a church in, that Luke is going to tell us about work being done there, etc., what kinds of things do you anticipate finding? What kinds of places were these? Everybody say old. I know they're all old places. Aside from that, Steve. Okay, they're going to be places more often than not that sit astride trade routes. You're going to find them either being situated close to or on water. Thessalonica has evidently one of the best harbors, if not the best harbor in the Aegean Sea. It's very useful for sea trade. It also sits on the Via Egnatia, and it sits just kind of at a crossroads of several different, very useful, very important trading roads. So you're going to find them being easily accessible, places that have, I think Steve used the word influence, or the idea of there being a lot of people who go in and out. These are busy places. There's a lot of traffic coming in and out. Start off with kind of a simple question. Why? Why go to a place like that? There's a lot of people doing what? Like we just talked about. Moving around back and forth. If you're trying to transmit information, if you are trying to get the news out, you're trying to spread the word, this is where you go. You go someplace people are coming in and out of very frequently. That's only going to help with the primary goal that these evangelists had, which is following that Great Commission, getting the word out to all the world, spreading the gospel to all nations, going to all 4 corners and seeing that message spread as wide as it could, as short a time as possible. So, all right, that's one thing we'll find often. Kenny? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right, and Luke really, in Luke's depictions of these churches that are established, seems to often seize on this idea of prominent people, wealthy people, also obeying the gospel. You'll find over and over, the Gospels, for instance, make it very much plain that the gospel often appeals to those who do not have means. The gospel often appeals to the poor. It often appeals to the downtrodden. But Luke seems to be trying to remind us as well, and probably because he has a particular audience in mind, it's not just for the poor. It's not just for those who are downtrodden, who don't have anything else in life that they could possibly cling to. You're also going to see prominent people. You're also going to see wealthy people. You're also going to see politically important people who can respond to the gospel as well. And so Thessalonica is a wealthy city, as, again, many of these others are, and that is going to have its function in the early church as well. Anything else? What else do we anticipate finding in some of these? Or in this one more specifically, if you know. Okay, where does Paul go? First time he steps foot in a city, he's going to go to the synagogue. He's going to preach to the Jew first. and then to the Greek. So, with maybe a few exceptions, you could talk about Philippi being a kind of departure from that norm. But very frequently, Paul is going into cities that have at least a moderately sized Jewish presence. Some of them have a kind of considerable Jewish influence in them, and a group of Jews that would have a lot of clout or might have more political means. I don't think that's really the case in Thessalonica, but very often you're finding him go places where you have a synagogue in place. Again, ask and answer. Why? Why do things that way? Why go to these places that are not completely Hellenized or not completely Roman in all of their character, but that have this Jewish element? What's the benefit there? Okay, one of the primary ways we see the gospel being preached in those early days is really through what we did last quarter, looking at the Old Testament, appealing to the testimony from Moses onward and saying, look, this is the Christ that is found in these promises that God made and these scriptures that God gave. And so if you have a familiarity with those things, if you know all about Moses and King David and Isaiah and all of those, you are a step ahead to understanding what the importance or the significance of this Christ is. So that's why the gospel goes to the Jew first and then to the Greek, because the Jew has that foundation where they can understand things more readily. That's the pattern we see Paul following regularly. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And that was instructive in its own right. That tended to be instructive to the people around them in its own right. Other things, anything else to mention there? What do we tend to find in these places? What would characterize them? Yeah, David? Okay. All right. What we'll end up finding happen in these places, there's going to be trouble that's caused. And, well, for various reasons, but a lot of times it does follow the same general reason that we'll see happening in Thessalonica. But we're dealing with, again, primarily these types of places. Like I said, when you do intro work on a lot of different letters or a lot of different churches or cities, it all starts to feel kind of samey. You say, well, this was the most important city in the region. Okay, I guess they all were. This was a very wealthy city that sat across a lot of trade routes. Well, yeah, okay, I feel like I've heard that before. It was had a very strong imperial presence, and the Roman emperor was thought of very highly and was worshipped here, along with numerous other gods. Well, yeah, all of them were. They had a synagogue and kind of a felt Jewish presence. Yes, but many of them were. A lot of those things are by design. Again, I think Paul chooses these places, or the Spirit chooses these places for him, largely with that idea in mind, because they are useful to the growth of the gospel. They're useful to the establishment of these stronger, more influential, more helpful churches that will help get the gospel out very quickly. And Thessalonica is really just going to be following that pattern generally. Yeah, and we'll see that probably next week in 1 Thessalonians 1 when we get into the actual text. That's one of the things Paul will mention. This church maybe especially had a kind of pagan or former pagan flavor to it. They had turned from those idols to serve the living God. And so that warning against that common theme in New Testament teaching. So in Thessalonica, you have a city that, like we said, is going to match a lot of those broad strokes. Was not by their reckoning at the time, not a particularly old city. I've mentioned before kind of the different clock that a lot of that area of the world works on. It's 300 years old, 350 years old by the time Paul goes there, which would be a very old place for us, but it wasn't for ancient Greeks, I guess. But it was founded around 315 BC by the brother-in-law of Alexander the Great, one of his generals, Cassander, had founded it and named it after his wife, Alexander's half-sister. It was, as we've mentioned, well situated. It's on a great harbor. It's at the crossing of major highways that go in all directions. You can get in and out very easily. It's accessible, it's useful, it's wealthy, it's influential. Particulars to Thessalonica that we'll see playing into the Acts account, at least. One is, as we talked about, a moderate Jewish population, enough for a synagogue, but maybe not so many that there's no evidence that the Jews in Thessalonica wielded significant power, that they were really able to contribute much to running things, or that they were really seen as a very necessary part of the city that would have had a lot of influence and a lot of clout. They would have been a tightly knit group and would try to be preserving or advancing their own lives just within that community, kind of an insular community almost, which leads into what we see in places like this, where when Paul begins having success in his preaching and when the church begins to grow, the Jewish leaders oftentimes become envious and become hostile towards them because they're having success where we aren't, or maybe they're having success that factors negatively against us. They're kind of drawing from our membership to have some of this success. So that envy becomes a part of the uproar that David was talking about a moment ago. Another maybe unique feature to Thessalonica, they do have the status of being a free city. They're considered a free city in the Roman Empire. They, for that reason, probably have a high view of the Roman emperor. He is worshipped there. They do have good relationships with Rome itself. You've got local power kind of concentrated on a few officials, and we meet them in Acts 17. These are going to be the politarchs. They are about 5 or 6 guys probably who are the main leaders of the city. They also work with a council, and we meet that in Acts 17 as well. And you have remains of temples to numerous gods, the imperial cult, synagogue, kind of this typical melange of religion that you would find as much of the rest of the world at the time. Well, let's consider the church itself then, and who Paul is writing to, who's going to be the audience. He's not just writing to the city of Thessalonica, he's writing to the Christians there. So open, if you would, to Acts chapter 17, if you hadn't already. Go ahead and open to Acts chapter 17, and we'll see how this church comes to be. As mentioned, I think you probably find Paul choosing Thessalonica as a target for long-term work for some of the factors that we talked about. You have him going through Amphipolis and Apollonia in Acts 17, verse 1. He's coming from Philippi, by the way, traveling on the Via Ignatia and going through a couple of cities, probably not stopping there very long, because he wants to get to this big place. I mentioned the size earlier. Tim asked a question a while back. I don't know, it's been several months, just when we were talking about some of the sizes of these cities. Kind of stumped me with that, of saying, how many people are we talking about when you talk about a large city, the largest city in Achaia or the largest city in Macedonia? How many actually is that? So I've started looking at that anytime I can to try to get in mind what you have. The estimates I could find from Thessalonica around this time, within the city walls, you'd have as many as 80,000 people, 65,000 to 80,000 people, which again, in our minds, doesn't seem, if you came from a town of 65,000 people, you might say, I'm from a small town, college town or something like that is kind of the feeling that might have. But if you've been to some of these ancient cities, or you looked at the ruins of them, and you kind of have some sense of where were the city walls, how big were they, they don't sprawl like Houston does, or pick any major American city, and you see that everything's kind of spread out, maybe especially the farther west you go in the United States. Picture 80,000 people living in one of those little old downtown kind of feeling ruin sites that you might have seen, and you get a sense for the press, the congestion, the density that population actually has. So you're dealing with a center of humanity, a center of population at the time. As many as 1,000 people, 100,000 people that would have been in the immediate vicinity, just right outside the wall. So Paul comes to this big place, this influential place, kind of the key to Macedonia, and is going to want to establish a church there. Who is with Paul at this time? So if it'll say it right there in chapter 17, you might have to. All right, Silas is with him, or Silvanus, I think is how it's usually translated in 1 Thessalonians when Paul's actually writing. And who else? I don't think he's mentioned actually in chapter 17. He is mentioned. All right. Paul, Silas, and Timothy. There might have been others that we know of, or other guys that we've met before. But for this leg of the journey, the ones that Paul is going to mention for us: Paul, Silas, and Timothy. Luke, it seems, being left behind in Philippi, maybe for the time being. So Paul, Silas, or Silvanus, and Timothy, they come to Thessalonica from Philippi. This is going to be early on in that second journey, probably around 49 AD, still kind of early in the career of Paul, as we might think of it. And you're going to find the typical or the customary preaching, as we've discussed already. They start in the synagogue. And I look at this passage a lot. You've probably heard me refer to this oftentimes. Acts chapter 17 is the beginning of several chapters where Luke really sets in order what Paul does in these synagogues, and he draws this focus repeatedly to the idea of reasoning with them. He will reason with the Jews in the synagogue. 17 and verse 2, verse 17, chapter 18, verse 4, verse 19, verse 28. He just repeatedly throughout this section appeals to that. But verse 2, we see, all right, what's Paul's approach? What's he going to do? He goes into reason with the Jews in the synagogue from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. So as we've mentioned, there's kind of the three-point process that Paul uses in this reasoning, in this logical presentation. The first is to argue for what the Christ does to begin with. And again, we looked at a lot of this in our last study, in the last few months. We looked at what do the Scriptures actually say about the Messiah, because that was not always a settled idea of who or what the Messiah is. What is the Christ going to do? Is he just a victorious champion? Is he somebody who's going to drive out the Romans from Jerusalem and establish the throne and the rule of David again, etc.? Well, Paul is able to use the Scriptures and demonstrate from them. Here's one thing, at least, that the Christ is going to do and has to do. He's going to suffer. He's going to rise the third day. He's going to be killed. That's the function of the Messiah. And so he is going to explain that to them. And then he's going to tell them about Jesus. And he's going to give them some of the, broad facts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And then he'll take those two things and put them together and say, this is that. This Christ that I was telling you about is this Jesus whom I was preaching to you. And so is going to, from that, definitively prove that Jesus is the Christ. And he'll do that work with the Jews in the synagogue for about 3 weeks. Now, who responds to this? Maybe try to kind of break down from verse 4 what the makeup of this group seems to be that responds to Paul's preaching. Who's going to listen and who's going to respond favorably? It seems like it goes in ascending order. Okay, you have at least 3 groups that are mentioned there. First, some of them were persuaded. That's the Jews that we were talking about. Some of them. and then a great multitude of the devout Greeks. That sounds like maybe more of these devout Greeks than the Jews that were under consideration first. And not a few of, that's kind of a classical term you find oftentimes to talk about a lot of. A lot of them happen to be some of the leading women or some of the prominent women of the city. Macedonia in general was famed for having these very powerful, very industrious women who got a lot of things done in their cities. And it seems like some of these were among the early believers in Thessalonica. So that response mentions three groups. And again, I think it's going in ascending order, telling us that there are some just Jews who have been Jews from birth maybe who are going to respond. Some devout Greeks, more devout Greeks, and from maybe both of those groups, a lot of women who are actually going to respond. There is one textual variant with this that will render verse 4 a little bit differently, that will have an and between devout and Greeks. So that would be breaking the Greeks up into maybe three groups by saying you had the prominent women, and you had the devout, or those God-fearers, those people like Cornelius, who were not proselytes, but they were familiar with the Scriptures. They were familiar with the Word of God. Maybe they had been to the synagogue before, but they were not full participants, the devout. And then you'd have the Greeks. You would just have people who, the week before, they were sacrificing a bull to Zeus, or whatever it might have been. I mean, you're really pagan Greeks. Whether or not that's the case, again, from Paul's writing to them, it seems like you do have that group involved as well. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But the picture is already one of a greater Gentile participation. Now, I think if we reconstruct the work that's done in Thessalonica, or kind of interpret it based on the whole Acts pattern with that in mind, it gives us something like this. Because the only time frame mentioned, what have we mentioned as the chronology, the time for Paul being there in Thessalonica, as far as Luke reveals it? How long? All right, 3 weeks, 3 Sabbaths, it says, Paul is going into the synagogue. Now, he doesn't give us another figure after that to say 3 weeks doing this, 8 weeks doing this, whatever. The next thing described is that an uproar is caused and he's going to have to leave. But from some other things that we can put together, I think we get the picture of Paul staying for much longer than this. I would argue for several months. Paul ends up staying here in Thessalonica altogether. Luke is simply reporting to us in the first case, those first 3 weeks are spent in the synagogue. But what Paul typically does, and this goes back to Acts chapter 13, he goes and he preaches in the synagogue, and typically there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of people saying, oh, I could go for some more of that next week. Why don't you come back then and we'll hear some more of this? Maybe even that goes on for another week. Then inevitably, what starts to happen? Sorry? Well, he stays in the city, but not with them, because they're in the synagogue. Eventually, whoever's in charge, whoever the leader is, starts to say, I don't like the way this is going. I don't like the kind of stuff you're saying here. A lot of this sounds blasphemous, in fact, what you're preaching here. And so you got to move it along down the road. You get out of here. And so he'll eventually either be sort of forcibly removed from the synagogue, or, I mentioned Acts 13, the pattern you see back there is from this kind of volatile, very emotional reaction against that Paul gets. Paul and Barnabas in that case will say, you guys don't want it? Great, we'll find somebody who does. And so they remove themselves from the synagogue, go to the Greek. Yeah. Okay. And typically, where Paul might be able to find that more is maybe if he's working a trade, maybe if he is out working as a tent maker or doing something where he's laboring in the marketplace or in a workshop, in an area where there is more non-Jewish foot traffic and where people are known to convene to listen to philosophers and to listen to teachers. And so Paul is going to do that in Thessalonica, evidently. He writes to them about them being able to observe him working day and night with his own hands so that he could provide a living for himself. So you find that immediate work in the synagogue, and then a rejection of it by many or most of the Jews, and Paul deciding, well, then I will go elsewhere, taking the message to the Greeks. It seems like when you read through Acts, and again, I wouldn't say this is a hard and fast rule, but it seems like those two things aren't really mixing. That, Paul goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath, on Saturday, but he has, office hours Monday through Friday with the Greeks. And he's just kind of mixing those two together. It seems much more like it is, I have my ministry to the Jews, and I do that for as long as they'll take it. But then when they stop and when they reject it, I take it to the Greek also. And you kind of have a separation of things. I mention that to say, I think when Paul starts this work among the Greeks in Thessalonica, it's probably at the end of that first 3 weeks. Yes. Yeah. There is some kind of, do what? Yeah. And seem much more engaged in that and do not come to the kind of hostility that ends up erupting in Thessalonica. There was something more impressive about the response he had in Berea. So you have that as sort of the beginning of the pattern, and I think that's mainly what Luke focuses on in Acts chapter 17 and telling us about the work there in Thessalonica. Again, he doesn't tell us a lot about this Gentile outreach, but we know from the other places Paul has gone, it happens. And we know from his letter to them, it's definitely who is in the church. So likely then he is moving from the synagogue and settling in the house of this Jason that we meet in verse 5. This is where the mob goes when the Jewish leaders stir up the mob, the agora dwellers, these kind of layabouts who are just, essentially waiting around in the marketplace for somebody to come pay them to start trouble. And these guys are attested to outside of the Bible as well, the agora dwellers. You could apparently manipulate them into causing all kinds of trouble. My mind immediately just went to what's going on in Great Britain, especially all the Just Stop Oil stuff. People blocking traffic and people just kind of making an uproar, making trouble, shouting stuff all the time, causing trouble and causing irritation. That's what you can go pay these guys to do. And there were some skillful political manipulators who apparently could go and say, all right, $5 if you start running around shouting, Titus is a jerk, or whoever it is, whatever kind of noise you wanted spread somewhere, you get these guys to do your dirty work. And that's who the Jews recruit there in verse 5. But where they go, all that to say, where they're going is the house of Jason. That seems to be where the church is, and where they know they can be found. And so Paul is probably setting up there just as he would do in the house of Justus, like in chapter 18, verse 7 in Corinth, or any of the other places where he would establish a teaching ministry in these other cities. And from there, he will preach to the general population. I mentioned the time frame, just a couple of things to consider. First of all, in Corinth, just to kind of put a possible time frame in mind. In Corinth, Paul removes himself from the synagogue. He departs from there. Look at chapter 18, verses 6 and 7. The Jews oppose him and blaspheme, and so he says, from now on I'll go to the Gentiles. And he departed from there in verse 7. He goes to the house of Justus. And then down in verse 11, he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. So the things that you have unfolding there, you have Paul removing himself from the synagogue, and then apparently continuing for a year and a half before the Jews reach this point of saying, gotta start dragging people out of their homes and trying to get the government to help with this. Now, I mention that just to say, when you read Acts 17 in verses 4 and 5, it sounds like it's happening very quickly, where, okay, he left the synagogue, and then, the Jews were still riled up about what he had been doing in the synagogue, so surely they're going to just have to go do all of this now. But not necessarily. It sounds quick, but a lot of things in Acts sound quick that might have been unfolding over weeks or months or years. That could have been germinating for a while before you actually have hostile action taken. We can also mention that Paul we'll talk about in Philippians 4 and verse 16. He's writing to Philippi, of course, the first Macedonian church established, and he commends them because they had sent aid to him twice, in fact. Philippians 4 and verse 16, even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities. So however long he's in Thessalonica, we know a few facts about this. One, he talks to them, he writes to the church about him working while he was there and establishing a pattern that he was a laborer who could take care of himself. He makes tents. He sets that up as a pattern of conduct. He's there long enough to set up a practice of some kind of meaning where he's working at a job. He's also there long enough for the Philippian church to twice send something to him, wait for that guy to get back, send something to him again to provide for his needs. These cities are not right next door to each other. You've got a distance that's got to be covered, and it's going to have to take probably a few weeks for that to happen. So Paul is staying there for at least 3 weeks. I'm going to have to say quite a bit longer. And the feeling that you get from reading 1 Thessalonians especially is of a man who has a relationship with these people and has really spent time among them. And they've had time to actually watch who he is, more so than you could develop in just a few weeks. There's a months-long relationship and kinship that develops between these two parties. Gary? Yeah. Yeah. And was much more complimentary than they meant it to, wasn't it? We look at that as Christians a lot of times and say, well, that's what I'm after. And that's what I'm trying to do with the gospel. I'm trying to turn the world upside down as well and turn people back to God. But of course, they're very upset. So this opposition that this envy ends up stirring up, it boils over, it leads to persecution from a mob, as we've already talked about. Paul and company go into hiding, it seems, for a short time. The brethren want to keep them secure, and so it seems that they hide them and then sort of spirit them away to Berea in the middle of the night, essentially. And it's from the road, sort of, that Paul is going to write to them. 1 Thessalonians, the letter, follows not very long after that kind of forced ejection from the city. Writing from Athens. He's writing after Timothy has come back to see him. Well, maybe from Athens. He's writing after Timothy has joined him again. You've got probably, again, just a few months elapsing, maybe 4 months between Paul leaving and this letter being sent on the way. Everything is still fresh in his mind. But what we'll find from the letter as we go on through it is Paul wants to get back to them. He wants to get back to see them again. This relationship that they had, this fellowship that they had between each other, Paul doesn't want that to just kind of dissipate. And they end up weakening and giving up and saying, well, maybe that was a foolish thing to do to begin with. No, he wants them to stay on this pattern of growth, and he wants to encourage them. It's a very, very pointed, very particular letter in that way. Close relationship between Paul and the congregation. He really stresses that pattern that he had displayed to them. There is mention of persecution in Paul's letter to them. There's mention of persecution as almost inevitable. But there's also the need for the saints to be productive and honest workers who loved all men, not just a select few disciples, and not to isolate themselves. They'd be distinct from the rest of the world through their character and through their ethics, not through an artificial separation that says you go away from them. He wants them to just be visible by who they are. And so Paul is appealing to this church to do that. And again, we can see the need for it based on what they're facing. He'll allude to maybe some affliction or some persecution they face from among their own countrymen in chapter 2. Apparently they're being put through some kind of difficulty, but his encouragement, of course, is to continue on and to continue growing. Briefly, let me just look at the letter itself. I'm about to run out of time. But as we mentioned, it's several months after leaving the city. He's anxious for news about them, so anxious that he sent Timothy to try to find out, how are they doing? I want to know what's going on with them. Go check them out. Come back and tell me what's going on. And Timothy has been able to do that. Now Paul is saying, I want to get back. All these things seem to be thwarting him. He's got all these reasons that just kind of keep coming up that hinder his plans for getting back to see them. But a key element of that pained absence is that Paul saw they had so successfully used him as a model for their conduct when he was with them. That they had been able to observe his life, his faith, his pattern of living. They've been able to see what a Christian is, what it looks like, because it was very new to them, I'm sure. This was a very foreign thing to many of the people there, especially these former pagans. They had done well while he's there. Well, now I'm gone, and I had to leave earlier than I wanted to. I didn't get to tell you everything that you needed to hear. I want to make sure that none of that is lost along the way, that none of that just goes by the wayside in my absence. So would they continue with so much success if he's not able to be among them as he wishes to be? That's what he's going to address often in this letter. All right, I'm going to lose the noise battle here in just a second, so I think I'll just quit there, and we'll pick up next week looking at the letter itself in 1 Thessalonians. We'll start in chapter 1, see what Paul has to say to this young, growing church, trying to encourage them to continue on as they've started. Thank you very much.